Welcome to the Nourish Child Podcast, a show about childhood nutrition, feeding kids, and dealing with the ups and downs of growing a healthy child. Here's your host, registered dietitian and childhood nutrition expert, Jill Castle.
Hey friends, welcome back to the Nourish Child Podcast. Jill here, and today I am so pleased to bring Nina Crowley on the show today. She and I met last winter at a conference in Scotland, and she was a speaker there and spoke on the topic of the psychology of eating. So today we talk about that and a whole bunch of other things around nutrition, psychology, diet culture, just a whole bunch of stuff. Raising girls. We hit on so many different things. So I know you're going to enjoy this conversation. Before we get started, I wanted to just briefly introduce her, and then we'll go right into the show. So Nina Crowley is a devoted advocate for improving communication, patient-centered care, and accessibility in obesity care. She has a PhD in health psychology from Walden University, a master's in healthcare policy and management from SUNY Stony Brook, and a BS in nutrition science from Cornell. She began her career as a bariatric dietitian and later served as the program director for the metabolic and bariatric surgery program at the Medical University of South Carolina. Currently, in her role as Director of Clinical Education and Partnerships for SICA's Medical Body Composition and Bioimpedance Analysis Division, she collaborates with healthcare providers to advance education on body composition analysis. She has significantly contributed to the field through publications, presentations, and media involvement, focusing on obesity care, behavior change, policy and advocacy, and body composition. I think you will love to hear what Nina has to say about all the topics around eating and size and raising children. It's a great conversation. You can listen to us on the podcast, or if you want to see us in action, you can head over to my YouTube channel, and watch our interview. Here she is. Hey, Nina, welcome to the Nourish Child Podcast. I'm so glad we finally got you on the show.
Yes, I'm so glad to be here. I think we could make it a 10-hour show, but I guess we won't.
We won't. But listen, before we talk about all the things we're going to talk about today, let the audience know who you are and the kind of work you're doing today.
Sure. Well, I'll try to make it quick. I'm Nina Crowley. I'm a registered dietitian and a PhD in health psychology. I work in body composition now after 18 years working in bariatric and metabolic surgery as a dietitian and a program coordinator. But that's jobs. Well, who I really am. I think my Twitter handle or X handle says it best. I'm a psychodietitian, and I think I really employ a fun and hopefully fun, connected way to talk about health and nutrition and all of the behavioral stuff that circles around food and eating. And now I've been able to apply that in body composition and really working in this realm where people are moving away from weight only and BMI. I know you're very happy about that. People are moving away from that. And it's been really nice to see using other metrics like adiposity and muscle mass and, these other more individualized metrics. And so that's what I'm working on now. But yeah, awesome. I'm a chronic volunteer lover, and I'm integrated with the bariatric dietitians, with the Obesity Action Coalition, with patients, with our, all the dietitian groups I can get a hold of. I love connecting with people in our field. So glad that we've connected and can kind of continue this conversation.
Yes. I think one of the reasons I wanted to have you on the show was this whole idea around psychology of eating. And as somebody who works with families and children, this comes up a lot in the conversations that I'm having with parents. What motivates their kids to eat? And some parents are just baffled by what is going on. Why is my child constantly talking about food? Why is my child unable to control themselves when certain types of foods are around. And I think a lot of this gets back to genetics and parenting and all that stuff. But I wanted to kind of dive into this slice of the world called psychology of eating. What does that mean to you?
Oh, wow. Well, it means a lot. It means a lot of different things. And I think the biggest component that I want to talk about is really the nuance. I think we share that passion to say it can't just be distilled into sound bites. It's not a slogan. It's not a just do this. I think so many asterisks on there of like, but you got to think about this and you can't do this. There's a lot of that when it comes to the psychology of eating, and for good reason. If it were that easy, I always joke and say, if it were that easy, there'd be one person out there and like Dr. Oz who would just tell everyone what to do, and that would be what we do. And so luckily, that's not our world. I think there is a lot more than just the right food, the best food. And we can talk about language and labels and black and white thinking and all of that. But there's just so much more than these ways that people talk about food and eating that is underlying, that's behavioral, that's psychological, that's, from when you're a child, from, the way that your parents were eating, all of these things impact our relationship with food. And so it's probably really hard to find any two people with that same sort of background or, history and experience. And so that's why I think it's a real kind of Venn diagram of stuff that we know that's general, healthy, good way to practice eating patterns for everybody. And then really taking that individual personalized approach of what's going to work for you based on your story. Yeah. And so to me, that's what psychology of eating and food decision making is. It's both of those things. And it's hard and it's nuanced, it's complicated. It's really something that I think it's great that for me, dietitians are really poised to be able to help people with this when they have some behavioral training involved as well. So lots of different components there, but worth exploring for people. And so I also feel like it's very important to say it's not that simple. It's not black and white. There isn't a one size fits all. Although, of course, in the social media world and in the media, it's constantly like, well, can you distill it down to a soundbite? Can we make this a message that, a diet plan or something that people would follow? And we don't necessarily relate to those terms, or there's just too much involved to really just make it blanketed advice for everybody.
Yeah, it is so hard when we've moved into sort of this news cycle of, make this information as down and dirty and simplified as you possibly can, but it does leave out the nuance. And I think that's always been sort of a barrier for me, an obstacle to social media for me. Even though I am out there and I am doing it, the nuance gets lost. And we've seen that. Like we see that in the shame and blame and the binary thinking around food very recently, even just with, an investigative, quote unquote, investigative article that came out from the Washington Post, basically talking about food shaming. And I think that is, that article made it sound like food shaming wasn't a thing, or it was a constructed or construed thing to sell, overly processed food, if you will. But food shaming is a real thing.
Right.
It's everywhere.
Yeah, I think I have so many thoughts on that article and just, trying to figure out the right response to that too, of just, I felt very much like they were tying together some concepts that were worthy of discussion, but they got it a little bit, not a little, they got it wrong as far as connecting, I don't know, the big food and that sort of concept and promoting this. They took something really small and nuanced. Like I wish we got media attention for a talk at Fancy this regularly, right? Like that's huge. I wish people cared more about what dietitians do. I always used to say, they have reality shows about the most obscure professions, right? Like truck drivers driving over frozen lakes in the north of the US. Then there should be shows about dietitians, because there's so many people that care and are interested in health and in eating and wellness that that should be a reality show. Well, instead it's a strange investigative report on, dietitians being the bad guys. So, just like with, I think, a lot of the recent attention about the anti-obesity medications, it's all press, good press. I don't know. It is elevating the conversation to a level where I think 2 or 3 years ago, even we wouldn't have been talking about it. So it does give us an opportunity to say, okay, here's someone's opinion piece, and I think here's where they got it wrong. So I do look at it in a little bit of a positive way to say, this is our chance to correct some of those, incorrect things. And so the component that they focused on with shame is super important, because again, in my role with working with people with excess weight for the past 2 decades, there's a lot of shame and blame about food choices. And even though there's more attention to it now, don't know that it's really gone away. And people still will say, oh, you're going to eat that. There's just this even when you say you're a dietitian, right? Oh, well, I guess you don't look at what I'm eating, right? Like, you can't go to a dinner party and say what you do. People have this assumption that you're this, holier than thou, up there on a pedestal, only eating good foods. And there's sort of this collective thought about what those good foods are. And when you're eating differently, promoting differently, talking differently about what foods are acceptable, I'm glad this is video, so I can use air quotes, because there's a lot needed in this conversation. If you're only talking about what's acceptable or dietitian approved type foods, that really strengthens that sort of feeling that there's good food, bad food. And if you want to be healthy, if you want to weigh less, if you want to be in this category of better, you've got to eat a certain way. And so it's funny, because I feel like in my experience with dietitians, for the most part, we are the profession that will say, yes, there's evidence out there talking about healthy eating patterns, foods that are better than others, foods that can help promote your health more than others. But you're a human working and living and being in a world where you can't always eat that way. And so I've only really surrounded myself with other nutrition professionals who understand that and take that person's experience and help them figure out how they can move the needle on being a little bit healthier, a little bit more optimal, closer to their goals. We're pulling people back from these big, lofty goals and sort of all the time saying, well, that's not probably realistic, just focusing on a weight loss goal, or just focusing on, well, I've got to follow this regimented eating plan forever. We're pulling them back and saying, but you've got to plop yourself back in your life. And if you do lose weight, or if you do achieve a health goal, how are you going to keep that forever? So to me, the dietitian role in making health behavior change is so critical, but it's so empathetic and understanding of the person's unique barriers and limits and responsibilities that I think we do really a good job helping people get towards their health goals and not shaming them for those choices. Whereas this article really didn't show that component, and like, how dare a dietitian recommend something that had added sugar in it, right? But how many, look at all the trends of, bagels and cupcakes and all the sweets that are in the world. But if they're homemade from a, kitschy artisanal bakery, that's fine. But God forbid you eat a sugary cereal, you're, on the hit list. It's very strange.
It is a strange world we live in. It makes me, think about parents out there who are raising kids and trying to navigate all these messages, and at the same time deal with their own eating psychology, however they were raised, what biases they assumed. And, I've watched over the 3 decades that I've been in practice, I've watched parents move from being curious about different foods and how they can all fit into a child's diet, and be relieved to find out that, yes, there is room for sweets in your child's diet or eating pattern, to today, where the biases against sweets and treats and anything considered indulgent or hyper processed or whatever, label you want to put on food.
Catastrophic label.
Yeah, is going to be catastrophic to their child. But their biases around these foods are so strong. It's like massive reprogramming that I'm having to do in some of my interactions with parents, and helping them see that, you're not thriving with these biases and this thinking. You're like caught up in this, second guessing yourself in every choice you make every single day. That translates down to your kids.
Totally.
Like how can you raise a child with a healthy relationship to food if you're constantly, living with your own hangups and food rules and, badness around what you eat?
Yeah.
What would you comment?
I'm just thinking, even this weekend, as I was, talking out loud about the article out loud, like to my boyfriend in the car, talking to him about it. And my daughter's in the car being like, but wait, what's wrong with Cheerios? I love Cheerios. And I'm like, nothing is wrong with them. Like, even just being aware of, wow, even just having this conversation in front of her is both complicated and also, I thought, my chance to really, talk about that nuance and talk about that topic. So I think of that all the time. I have a 10-year-old daughter, and I feel very conflicted about, this spectrum. I'm always thinking, well, what do I do to prevent, health problems from excess weight? What do I do to prevent disordered eating due to all of the, food rules and stuff that gets said around her that I can't control? And I think for, any parent, that's a really tricky place to be, because you want to help your kids do better than we did. And I think actually the realization of how our parents had, interacted with the diet culture back then, and how they were low fat and, just very food villain focused, that's translated to our cohort of parents right now. And we're doing the same in a way to our kids. So I appreciate the work that you do with kids so much, because this is a really important relationship that you have with a little person who is going to be a grown up soon, and they have to navigate this world. So and I only have one, so I can't imagine having multiple kids too, where everything you say, they hear and they internalize. I spend a lot of energy and really work hard to never say a negative thing about my own body, regardless of what's going on in my head about it. To, not talk about foods like, I read your blog today, just talking about this good food, bad food. Oh, I wouldn't have that. I'm on a diet. And, all of that stuff that we talk about, and that's so common. And when I hear it, maybe this is my psycho dietitian coming out, right? But if I hear people saying that around my kid, I am not at all hesitant to put them back in their place and say, I'm sorry that your relationship with food is a little screwed up, but, don't talk about that in front of my kid. Don't talk about weight loss. Don't talk about a diet. Don't talk about restrictive eating, or, even just, we had Easter, and everybody's conversations about, doling out a certain number of jelly beans or whatever. Like, we're just, in all the ways, not just with food, we have such a fear of the kids being able to figure it out themselves and rely on their internal signals for hunger and all of that. It's like, if you tell them exactly what to do and exactly what to have, that's the only way they're going to know what to do. And when you're not there and you're not providing that external guidance and structure, what do they have left? So I work really hard to try to figure out how to teach her the internal, well, what are you hungry for that? Do you want to continue, and not label it as, oh, you can only have this if you do that. That part. And I know that's what you focus on a lot. So I'm happy to learn from you in ways to do that better for myself. Even that's where I think it's really at, is figuring out how to help the next generation not have the problems that we did. They'll probably have a new version of problems, but at least not the same ones that we did.
True. Well, it is, you bring up this whole, like, it's so hard to, not be dichotomous about food. Food is either good or it's bad. And what I have noticed is for some individuals, some parents, some professionals, going from, let's not say foods are good or bad. Let's not be black and white about it, but they swing the pendulum to the other side and say, like, let's have these quote unquote bad foods all the time, whenever your child wants it, access around the clock. And I'm not sure. I don't believe, it's not that I'm not sure. I don't believe that's the answer either. And so there's this like funky little line between health and emotional well-being that is really hard to walk. It's hard to find that path. I think, again, there's this so much nuance because it's not going to be the same path for one family as it will be for another family because of the psychology of eating, of the genetic background, of the family upbringing, the family resources. Like, it's all going to be different for every person. But I think, moving from one spectrum or one end of the spectrum and flipping all the way to the other side is not necessarily the way to go. That usually doesn't pan out either. It's that monkey in the middle, that moderation part that's so not sexy. Nobody wants to hear about it, but it truly is, I think, the path to freedom. I think in a lot of ways.
Yes, well said. And I think you bring up a good point, sort of this, again, having a catchphrase in a word, like you mentioned, calling it anti-diet, there's a lot of nuance in that term that I think we understand. That's a whole philosophy and a way of approaching health and wellness. But to the consumer or to someone who hears anti-diet, well, okay, that means no diet, no focus on health and nutrition, just eat whatever. I mean, that's the real miss, is people thinking that means eat whatever. And so it's, again, in the middle zone would be having an environment that supports autonomy for kids and has, them being able to choose from a menu of different options, having them not vilify sweets and, sugary foods, all across the board. And because then they can have a few and pass it up. I mean, isn't it the most beautiful thing? I'm sure you see this all the time when a kid has access to the foods that we would be so uncomfortable with them overindulging on. And they have a couple bites and they're full, but they know that they're full because of their own internal developed sense of, hunger and fullness and wanting and satiation and all of that. Yeah. Like, okay, I'm good. I mean, I love that. But you don't get that when you hide the foods and you don't let them around. I see this a lot with friends of mine's kids where they're, and I try really hard not to, I ride that line of not being too aggressive, right? But I try hard not to say, okay, you really don't need to be doing that. But they hide the foods. They talk about sweets like they're awful. And I've had more than a couple friends who are like, oh yeah, it's weird. I found the kids sneaking food. They're hiding it. Well, then when I put it around, they'll eat all of it. And so I'm like, well, yeah, do we not see the connection between restriction and overindulgence that happens when you put those foods on a pedestal? Like, just like my daughter said to me yesterday, I guess it was, with the eclipse, like, but you're telling me not to look at it. It really makes me want to look at it. So you're telling me not to have these foods. It really makes them want to have them. And so, instead, okay, that can be part of it. We have, all the things that we do to try to foster that healthier relationship with some of these foods. It's really nice to see that in play. When they're able to make those decisions. And that has a lot to do with intrinsic and extrinsic motivation. It has a lot to do with not using black and white terminology. And really, we are going to struggle with our kids having perfectionist tendencies, right? But we don't make it easier when we are that way. And when we, off my diet. I fell off my plan. It's all, over. And we're saying that kind of stuff in front of them. That doesn't make it easier for them to have a normal relationship with food either.
True. I laughed really loud when you talked about the eclipse because I didn't have glasses to watch the eclipse, but my husband was like, come outside. You got to see this. And I was like standing out there and I said, no, I can't look at it. It makes me want to look at it to be out here. So I'm going back inside. It's the same thing. It's like, right. I know I'm not supposed to look at the eclipse without those glasses, and being out here in the environment makes me want to look up. So I'm out.
It's like the white polar bear, right? Like, don't think of a white polar bear. Is that the
something? I don't know. Yeah. So what's your thoughts on, just today's adults? We won't necessarily even say parents, but today's adults and childhood history of upbringing. And we're all different ages. I'm in my late 50s. And what I will say was there was really no focus on dieting or food or any of that in my upbringing. I was raised in the Midwest. I'm sure my mother was sort of naturally lean. She was a smoker, so she wasn't eating a lot during the day. So she was really lean, and food was a celebration when she actually sat down to eat. So I think, back then, the context of my own childhood was that food was not a focus at all. I don't even think, I never even heard of the word diet. I remember the first time I actually heard the word diet, and that was my friend in high school, our senior year when Diet Coke came out. And I'd had very few interactions with soda in general. And more because of a financial thing. I mean, my parents were middle class. There were 4 of us, that we were very much on a budget, for a food budget. And my friend was like, have you ever tried Diet Coke? And we were at the pool and I was like, no. And so I tried it. I didn't like it because it was too sweet. I thought it was too sweet. But that was the first time I ever heard the word diet. And so every adult today, whether you're in your 20s, I've got girls in their 20s, my daughters, all the way up to your 50s and your 60s, you're coming to the table with all these different backgrounds, right? And some of these backgrounds are your upbringing. Some of it's the culture of the times. Mm-hmm. What do you think the culture of the times today is doing to, our youngest parents?
Well, I think it's interesting that when you started to talk about your story, and I think this is a common story for a lot of us, is you first went to financial and how that impacted your food decisions and not decisions even, but just availability, right? Mm-hmm. And I think if we were to ask people their food story from the past, that would probably be a fairly common story. I have a similar one where this was just not an option. And so that layers on availability in a way that I think we're missing that a lot these days, right? So we do a lot of this talk of, I always talk about evidence-based practice, and the first component of evidence-based practice is evidence and research. And so I think people tend to focus on that, like, what's the best way of eating? What's the best diet to follow? What's the best, right? That is one component of how we practice, how we eat, how we think, and all of that. The other components are, for a provider talking to somebody, our own experience and how we've worked with patients over the years. And the most important is the patient values in that side of the equation. And so I think it's of course interesting to hear your first part was to talk about your patient values or your person's values and experience, because finance had a role in that. I don't think we're seeing a lot of that on social media, which is the biggest place where people are getting their nutrition information these days. That's scary. That's impacting our youth and our young parents as well, where they're not going to a dietitian or a nutrition professional who's going to help them take what's out there, take the evidence and help apply that to their own life for a long-term sustainable plan deal with all that nuance. They're just saying, well, this is what I saw, or I see a body of someone who I want to emulate, and I'm going to follow what they did. I mean, it's shocking and scary and depressing to find out people following eating patterns of folks just because they like what the outcome is, and they're judging their body as the outcome. I'm following what she does because I like what she looks like. Why aren't they looking at our credentials? Why are they looking at our experience, right? So I think that's going to definitely be an impact on young adults and their kids, which is trends. And that's what's important in keeping engagement on these platforms. So it's people saying, well, I'm going to try, I mean, this week it's the oat Zempic, right? Like blending up cold oatmeal with lime and water. I mean, that sounds terrible. Why would people be willing to follow that instead of some of these more moderate things? I think our brains are just wired to think about two buckets, all or nothing, good or bad. And like rigid or moderate is just, it's easier to do let me just try this one thing. I'll do it for a couple of weeks and that'll make an impact. It's very strange, right? I think those trends and following what other people are doing is really going to have an impact, and these are people that when they get to middle age and their bodies change and their, metabolism and their, all of these other things change, then they have a different experience. And the skills that they relied on, I mean, probably with your daughters at this point, they can eat a variety of foods and they can eat a higher calorie per day than someone who's a decade older and a decade older. And so if we don't have the skills to navigate, this is what's natural, this is what's supposed to happen, this is our bodies changing, that's going to be complicated for them as well. And there's no one size fits all answer to that. And there's no, TikTok's not made for nuance. It's made for something silly that's notable. And what's less notable than moderate, healthy eating?
Right. Exactly. And it also makes me worried that we are, giving up our wisdom, our inner wisdom. We're handing it over to a 30-second Instagram reel. And we're letting that sort of override any internal wisdom that we have about what our bodies need, what we're comfortable with. It's very sad, actually.
Yeah. And
in a lot of ways.
And I like calling it internal wisdom too. I always think about intrinsic and extrinsic motivation on, health behavior, because the intrinsic is really that internal wisdom that, I know what I like. I'm going to do this for the internal inherent enjoyment of it. Like we talk about that with exercise and movement. Like I enjoy doing this, so I'm going to do it. I like this food, so I'm going to do it. People think they have to shut that off in order to focus on something that someone else is telling them to do. So there's really this impression that the other people know better than we do. So I'm going to follow what they do. That's the ultimate extrinsically motivated decision making. And that does not work long term. I mean, really, spoiler alert, following someone else's anything doesn't work long term. People get swayed by a short-term result, or, again, this focus on weight is so prevalent, but I lost weight doing this, so it must be okay. Not even thinking about, hey, you lost a rapid amount of weight. What is that doing to your resting metabolic rate? What is that doing to your muscle mass if you lose muscle mass too quickly? Like these are things that, you don't think about. It's just this focus on, I did a thing, I lost weight, must be good. Well, you don't know what you're talking about because, you didn't lose weight doing that. And that there's so many layers to that we could probably get into. But like you said, the movement away from internal wisdom, knowing what's best for yourself, that's not something that you can post online. No. That's not, your personal story is probably not as, Instagrammable or TikTok worthy as some of these things. And so it is sad. We only can hope that people who people can get into individual, dietitians, behavioral health providers, folks that can really help them navigate their own relationship if they're not able to do it themselves, and really, get on that path to internal, intrinsic sense of what healthy, optimal, whatever the term is, that, just feeling good about yourself is.
Yeah. As we sort of bring this to a close and wrap this up, as you think about, you're a parent yourself, as you think about parents who are out there listening, if you had to give them some advice related to, social media or parental wisdom or any of the things that we've talked about today, black and white thinking, eating psychology, what is it that you feel is important for parents out there to know?
I think approaching this topic and this conversation with your kids about curiosity is really a big tenet for me of, how can we help our kids have a better relationship with food? We can be curious and ask questions about what they like and what they want and what they're hearing. I mean, I'm hearing even at 10 years old, what some kids are, talking about carbs and different things that she's hearing at school. So for me, approaching these as questions to find out what she's hearing, what she's learning, without judgment and saying, well, that's crazy. They're bad for saying that, right? I don't want to be the food police for her. So I think approaching the topic with your kids from a curiosity lens is important. And knowing that just because people had success, if that's what they're calling success, with some sort of pattern, good for them, right? I think another part we could talk about is the Oprah talk about shame and blame, because there's so many layers to that. But I loved her piece at the end where she's like, you want to do it this way? Bless you. You want to do that way? Bless you, right? It's sort of like, you do you and let me do me. And so if people don't have education and information and are seeking that, that's a completely different bucket than people who know and have a good education about food and eating and what nourishing food looks like for their kids and are being swayed by the external. So I think we've got to think about there's a definite role for optimal health and figuring out what that is for you. So we're not saying don't attempt eating healthfully. There's a lot of benefits to some of the basic and moderate eating tenets of, eating fruits and vegetables, getting in fiber, lean sources of protein, all of that stuff. There's definitely some benefit to that, and reducing, added sugars and processed foods, right? But what we want to make sure is that this is coming from the internal, the inner wisdom, the voice of, well, this is also a kid. The kid does not need to be, maybe reading a food label or looking at what the calories or the carbs are at this age. Depending on the kid. I don't think that's probably something we want kids focusing on. We want to do better by them by helping them develop their relationship with food. And I think I'm excited to see sort of what you talk about in your new book, because to me, it's not focusing on size, and it's really focusing on, not telling a kid who's a little bit heavier than their peers that they have to eat in a completely different way as a punishment for the way that their body looks like. And that is, I need this at this time, as she's about to enter puberty age. And I think things are going to get harder for girls at that age, no matter what generation we're in. Yeah,
for sure. For sure. Well said. I think we have, I think dietitians are integral to our society. And I hope that, parents out there who are listening, embrace the role of nutrition and dietitians. I think what you said about, if you have the knowledge, then go with your internal intuition. But if you don't know, and there's a lot of parents that are confused by what's out there, that they don't know, don't let somebody else who's not qualified or tell you what to do.
Right. And the best or the way or the right way to eat isn't for everybody. So
Right.
it's also okay to say, cool, bless you. That's good for you. But that's not, when I determine best, I'm looking at evidence as one of three things. I'm looking as a parent, your own experience, and then as your, the patient value would be the kid's experience. So best is taking all three of those into account, and that's going to be different for everybody. So also don't be afraid to not go along with something that's being touted as what we all should be doing, because it doesn't work for you for one of those other reasons.
Right. Exactly. I think we learned a lot by looking at keto and paleo and all these like trendy diets that have come and gone. And some of those are still around, but we've also got medical doctors who used to follow keto and who are coming out and saying, it doesn't work. I lost all my muscle mass. It didn't work for me. It doesn't mean that it's a bad diet. It just may mean that it's not the right, eating pattern for everybody.
Or that focus, the focus there tended to be on weight loss. And if you're just looking at weight as an outcome and not looking at somebody's muscle mass or their changes in their adiposity, you're missing a big part of that story. And so I think that the culture seems to be shifting to where people are rejecting that to some extent and saying, okay, there's more individualized parameters that we need to consider. So I think that's a positive.
I think that's a positive too. Yeah. Well, Nina, thank you so much for coming on the show and sharing your wisdom. Where, if people would like to get in touch with you, what's the best way for them to do so?
Oh, thank you. This was great. I could talk to you all day about this. I'm on Instagram as Nina M. Crowley, and LinkedIn is where I talk a lot professionally about these topics, also with my name. And then my company, Sika North America, you can follow us on Instagram or LinkedIn as well. And we're talking a lot about, other metrics besides weight and looking at muscle mass, which is, again, an exciting time in our current culture these days.
Quick question about that. In terms of developing children, is there anything on the horizon from Sika to look at their body composition?
We have had some new formulas that we've inputted to our device so that we can look at younger cohorts of kids to look at where their body composition would stand up with a reference group. So we used to have, 16 to 18 was kind of the lower age limit. And now we've, with new data, been able to extrapolate that down by looking at that group of younger folks. And so in kids and adolescents, it's about 8 to 9 years old. It's based on height, where they put their hands on the device when they're looking at bioimpedance. So that's a new development, and that we're able to sort of say, hey, here's where your muscle mass stands up to other kids of your, reference group. And I think that's been helpful. It's definitely a different focus than looking at just weight and BMI. I know back when I did my master's thesis, I was looking at, the impact of BMI in, remember BMI report cards and telling families and all of that. I was like, what is the knowledge, attitudes, and beliefs of school folks around that type of a thing. And that has changed in 20 years dramatically. So now, luckily, we're not seeing, I guess, right, people doing that as much. I don't know.
I just saw an article about the state of Arkansas, like sending them out, being the biggest, the state that sent the most. Now, I don't know if that's current day or if that's just over the last 10 years or I didn't dive into it, but
that's a dramatic shift.
Still out there.
Because again, that came from a good place of, okay, we need to help give, I think it came from a good place. We have to help give people feedback on where they're at. But, just telling someone, hey, you're here and this is where your, weight puts you at, that didn't give them what they needed, which was maybe help, support, resources, how to have that conversation, how to not feel stigmatized and all of that. But yeah, I think, moving away from that, I am seeing more programs, not just programs who are like obesity care comprehensive programs, but just in general, looking at body composition in kids and figuring out how we can communicate that to families in a positive way, because I think it's a better metric for sure. And we do want to focus on strength and function and things like that much more than these other numbers.
Yeah, I agree. All right. Thank you so much. I will, we'll be in touch.
Yeah. Thanks, Jill.
Appreciate you so much.
Be on here. Talk soon.
Thanks for listening to the Nourished Child Podcast, where the #1 goal is to help you grow a nourished child inside and out.